Welcome back to OZK 150. We're going to talk about Ozark crafts and folk arts today. And before we do, though, we have our usual opening Guess Who. And today, the famous Ozarker, I bet somebody knows who this is. Yeah. George Washington Carver. Okay, yeah. I figured a few people would know George Washington Carver. His connection with the Ozarks is he was actually born and raised in Newton County, Missouri, down in southwest Missouri, not too far from Neosho. The popular misconception about Dr. Carver was that he invented peanut butter. He actually didn't invent peanut butter, but he did do all kinds of experiments with peanuts and other sorts of agricultural crops, and became one of the best-known scientists of the first half of the 20th century. Spent much of his career at Tuskegee Institute, now Tuskegee University in Alabama, and today there is his home place in Newton County. There's a national monument there and a little museum, and it's worth a visit down to extreme southwest Missouri. But that's George Washington Carver, and so there we go. A little more serious than the ones we usually have. You know, there's just not a lot of funny stuff you can say about George Washington Carver. He was a scientist, and so. All right. And this is pronounced Rosneers. And I know somebody's going to know what a Rosneer is. You know, Millie knows what a Rosneer is. What is a Rosneer? Yeah.
It's a roasting
ear. It's a roasting ear of corn. Yeah. That's you can use roast ear in other ways as well, but that's generally what it is. In the Ozarks, a roasting ear is a roast ear, and there's even I know of one place in Arkansas that has a roasting ear creek, but it's roast ear creek. So that's what that is. A ripe, ear of corn. You best get busy gathering them roast ears, Hubert. That wildcat ain't going to make itself. All right, that's the next word for the day. Wildcat. Does anybody know what wildcat is? In this context, can you figure out why Hubert's making wildcat? Yeah. Moonshine, corn liquor, whiskey. Yeah, that's what. You still can come across some old-time Ozarkers in the rural Ozarks who don't call it moonshine, but call it wildcat. And a wildcat still was an illegal still, a moonshine still that someone had hidden back in a holler somewhere or in a cave or something, and they made wildcat.
Like wildcat money, like before they minted money, like the feds, if you had money from another state and try to spend it.
It's wildcat money. Yeah, it's probably has the same meaning, something illegal. Yeah. So.
Were these illegal stills as common as folklore has them?
Probably so, yeah.
Back in every little holler?
Well, they were, the making of illegal whiskey was very, very common. And our popular culture and folklore may tend to exaggerate it a bit, but it was very common, and it still goes on a little bit today. But there's a lot more other illegal activities that Ozarkers are more interested in nowadays than making whiskey. And of course, there are some legal moonshine distilleries today. That's kind of a thing that's happened in the last few years.
They used to have
a little boutique.
They
would do every year they would have the little show where they would they bring somebody in and make it and stuff. I don't think they do that anymore, but the guy the moonshiner, I guess, died probably, but it was at one time very, very common, probably especially in the 20s and 30s during Prohibition. But moonshining goes way back beyond that, and the earliest settlers into the region would have brought the knowledge of making whiskey with them and making wine, beer, other sorts of things as well. So that's what Wildcat is. Yep. And this particular Wildcat's made out of corn. Okay, let's talk a little bit about folk art and some folk customs. And a couple of these things are things that we've already talked about, and we'll continue discussions in a couple of weeks of some of the things that we start talking about today. But let's think about, in terms of folk arts, folk customs, these are things, again, as we've talked about, that these are traditions, arts, customs that are brought to the Ozarks in the 1800s for the most part, from back east of the Mississippi, from Appalachia, from other places back east, with the earliest settlers. These are just practices that they were already familiar with and that are not unique to the Ozarks. They're things that link us with that frontier experience of Americans moving across the North American continent. And all of these things would have been very common in the 19th century Ozarks, and some of these would have been common well into the 20th century Ozarks as well. Some of these folk customs had to do with life on the frontier and activities on the frontier. You remember last time we talked about when the settlers came, there was a certain order that they needed to build themselves a shelter, and then they cleared fields and made fence rails and all that kind of stuff. And these folk customs and folk activities often spring up around these necessities of frontier life, so that a house raising became a community or at least a neighborhood sort of event. A house raising would involve the building of a house. And in the 19th century Ozarks, this would most often be a one-room cabin, a one-room pen of some sort. And it was an activity that a group of men could do in very short order, especially if you had one or two who were really handy with an axe and good at notching logs and that kind of thing. And practically every community back in those days would have had somebody who fit that description. And a house could be put together pretty quickly. You could also have, you've heard of barn raisings. You could have crib raisings. Just any sort of building activity. And this would bring people from the community together to, say, build a house for somebody. And the payoff at the end of the day for a long, hard day's labor, or maybe 2 or 3 days worth of labor, would be a party at the end of the day. A big meal. Well, usually you'd have a big dinner. And in the Ozarks, when do you eat dinner? In the middle of the day. You dine around noon. You sup in the evening. So it's dinner and supper. Just don't get that wrong. That's a bad mistake in the Ozarks. Although for the most part we've conformed with the rest of society and we've started talking about lunch and dinner. But for old-time Ozarkers, it's dinner and supper. But you would have a big dinner that the women would prepare during the day while the men were working. And then at night, you would eat again and often have a party with dancing, fiddle music, maybe, unless it was a very sort of, tamped down religious family who might not believe in dancing or something like that. But dancing, usually there would be some sort of whiskey involved, a little bit of wildcat involved in this. That was one of the payoffs. That was one of the ways to get men to come out and help, promising that there will be a couple jugs passed around at the end of the day, and you can imbibe freely. But I think I've got here, if I can find it. Now this is an account of a house raising, and I'm just going to read a little bit of this. It's a house raising, and it's actually a smokehouse raising. This is a family and a neighborhood who got together to build a smokehouse, and it's a good description. It's late 1800s. It's not pre-Civil War, but it's in the rural Ozarks in Arkansas. And the guy writing about it, he's actually writing in the 20th century as an older man, but he's remembering back to his childhood, well back into the 1800s. And he writes, he was a kid at this time. I got on my horse and rode over the settlement, inviting the men and women to come to our house the following Thursday. The men to the house raising and the women to the quilting. So the women were having a social function as well. While the men were building the smokehouse, the women were going to be quilting, doing the old quilting bee sort of thing. That was one way we had of getting along. Every man stood ready to assist his neighbor in doing something that he could not do alone. There were 12 or 15 men at our house that morning, and every man had brought his wife, daughter, or sister. We began on the smokehouse by laying 2 logs about 14 feet apart. With axes, we cut notches in the ends of the logs, then built on up to the height we wanted. There were men on hand who were very proficient in notching the ends and keeping the corners even, and while the process was slow, we had the walls up before night. On occasions like this, people expected something a little more pleasant than hard work. My father had supplied himself with a gallon of whiskey, and when we went in to dinner, he brought out the jug and every one of the men took a drink. My mother also looked out for her friends. She had obtained 2 bottles of Garrett snuff, and as the women quilted, they passed around the snuff bottle often, and all would take a dip. Now this was very common in the Ozarks, well into the 20th century, for women to dip snuff. For a toothbrush, each procured a small green stick, preferably black gum, and chewed one end of it until it was soft. They would then dip the mop end of the stick into the snuff and put it into their mouths. And he's still talking about the women here, the snuffing women. When the walls of the house were up and the quilting finished, the people all went home, but most of them came back that night, for it was the custom on such occasions to give either a social or a party. We gave a social, for party was just another word for dance. We had all the improved land we could work, but a tract of about 5 acres was worn out. It was so old and worn that it would not produce corn or wheat, and when land got that way, it was fit only for pasturing. Yeah, I didn't want to read that. Let's see. Here's the log rolling part. As the spring drew near, it was time to roll logs. During the fall and winter, many trees had fallen in the field, and they had to be piled up and burned. We didn't cut them up for firewood, for timber was too plentiful. My father and I went into the field and chopped the logs into totem lengths, and we invited our neighbors into a log rolling. About 15 men, probably the same ones, came bringing hand sticks with them. We shoved hand sticks under the logs, and the men would take hold of the hand sticks, a man at each end of the stick. Remember, we talked about this with log rollings, and pick up the log and tote it to the spot where we decided to make the log heap. When the logs were all gathered into piles, we could then set fire to them and burn them up. And then he goes on to talk about how these log rollings were opportunities for men to display their strength and to try to show that they were stronger than the other men, because one of the things that they would do is, remember, you were always working in tandem with at least one other guy. If the logs were short enough, you had your 2 sticks and you hoisted them up, and there's a guy holding the other ends of the sticks, and whoever could lift the log higher and sort of roll it on the guy who couldn't, he's the stronger guy, or maybe just the taller guy. It could be. But apparently that was something kind of fun to do, unless you were you got the bad end of it and the log rolled on top of you. But these, again, were community functions designed to bring people together. You think about how much time a family in the 1800s in the rural Ozarks spent just with themselves and not socializing with neighbors. And they really, humans are social creatures, most of us. Not all of us are, but most of us. And they tried to think of any opportunity that they could to have social gatherings, and most of them had to do with work in those days. And we all know if you've done any sort of social work experiment, it makes the work go faster. You get to visit with neighbors. You know, the day goes by quicker, that kind of stuff. And the women would, you know, find their opportunities to socialize as well, having quiltings while snuffing. You know, that's any of you ever been around a woman dipping snuff?
My great-grandma.
Your great-grandma, yeah. Did she have a snuff stick or just put it in there?
Just, she didn't use a stick.
Yeah, yeah. I can remember older women in my family when I was a kid used to do that. And I had this one, it was a great aunt, and her house always smelled like snuff and cats. Because she had several cats in there and newspaper. You know, if you got cats in your house, I guess you have newspaper everywhere. But I still remember that smell from when I was a kid in the 70s, snuff and cats. You know, not the best smell in the world, but I haven't been around a snuff dipping woman in a while. I don't know how that's, you know. All right. So rail mauling, we talked about the necessity of building rails last time. Of course, this is in the days of, if you're talking about the 19th century Ozarks everywhere, well into the 20th century, the days of the open range when you fence in your crops and the animals run out. And in those days, you didn't have barbed wire, so it didn't come to the Ozarks till the 20th century. And your fences were primarily made out of rails. Sometimes you would have stone fences, but mainly you had rail fences. And a rail mauling was, as it sounds like, it was a group project where you brought people from the community together and you just you made a bunch of rails. Cut down trees, split the logs into rails, and there you go. I was looking at let's see if I can find, here it is. Now this is a lot of, you know, we've all heard of Abe Lincoln, the rail splitter, as a young man. That's what he was making. He was making fence rails. If you never knew what a rail was that he was splitting, he was splitting logs into rails. And you do that with wedges, axes, you know, that sort of thing. It's not a real detailed kind of activity. But I was looking at this is an old diary of a young man whose family moved from Virginia into central Missouri in 1819. So way back there, even before Missouri became a state. And he talks about a lot of stuff. His diary's not real wordy, but it's a kind of the perfect insight into life on the rural frontier of Missouri, kind of the northern edge of the Ozarks at that time. He talks about going to log rollings and camp meetings and different things that we have talked about and will talk about this semester. But one of the things I thought was interesting is in March and April of 1820, on several days he and his brothers spent splitting rails. And he mentions one day, March 22nd, 1820, he and his brother split 300 rails. Now, that's a lot of work. That's a whole lot of logs and a lot of rail splitting. By 2 days later, March 24th, he says they finished making their rails. They'd spent 2 or 3 days working on them, 3 or 4 days, I guess, working on them, and had over 700 rails split. You can make a lot of rail fence with 700 rails. And then he mentions in early April 1820, April 7th and 8th, he and his brother, two of his brothers, Thomas and John, this guy's name is James Campbell, or Camel, as they probably said it back in those days. He and his two brothers spent 3 days splitting rails and made 1,000 of them. So we're assuming he was telling the truth. I don't know why he wouldn't have been, but that's a lot of work. And then he mentions a few days later there's a log rolling at a neighbor's house. Then he mentions the very next day there's a log rolling at the Campbell house, at his house. And so there's a lot of neat stuff, a lot of insight into that. And he also mentions a house raising and a crib raising.
Why is that is that the type of fence that you're speaking of?
Yeah, those are.
So which one is the rail? Is it just one individual?
Yeah, each one of these is a.
It really doesn't
is
seem
a rail.
like that much then, because if you figure like 10, and then so 70, if it were 700, you know?
Oh, you mean it's not actually going to go that far?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
That's why they need so many of them. You know, 700.
Right.
Yeah. If you're talking about, it's not going to go around this campus.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But that's why, they cut 700, and then a week and a half later, here they are making 1,000 more of them, and I'm sure made more than that. And that would be incentive for me to have really small fields, really small crops. But it'd be a lot of work. And I think earlier I mentioned that a standard length for these rails is probably about 10 feet. I was reading one account from pre-Civil War Missouri where the guy said they always cut theirs 10.5 feet. I'm not sure why the 10.5. There may have been a reason for that. He didn't say. But, these are pretty long rails.
I was just going to say, actually at my parents' house, we have a split rail fence.
Uh-huh.
And I've had to build it a couple
You've
of
had-
times.
yeah.
Yeah, it's not a lot of fun.
Yeah. Do you remember what kind of wood you used?
I think we use cedar just because we have a lot of
Right.
trees on our property.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And every now and then, for the most part, they've lived there for like 30 years. And I think we did some touch-up work on it like one time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The cedar will last quite a while. And I have never split rails. I've made cedar posts, split cedar logs to make posts with, and it's the same concept. Yeah.
You said they fenced their crops in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, deer can jump over that.
Yeah, this is
Rabbits can get.
that's
through
just
it.
for looks.
Did they make them high enough that the deer couldn't get in?
In the 19th century, deer could not jump as well as they could.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how high. I mean, you had to really go high to get them, high enough for a deer not to jump over.
I'm sure they use like
But-
urine, like human urine or something like that. I'm
There
sure
were
they
a
have
lot
some
of deer
remedies
then.
in order to keep
Well, yeah, they would have had scarecrows and stuff like that. But we know that if there are enough deer around,
Doesn't matter.
eventually, they're going to get in there. But the main thing they were worried about were the really destructive things. Deer come in, they ease around a little. They can be destructive if there are a lot of them. But hogs were, just can tear up stuff terribly. And so that they were really wanting to keep the hogs and the cattle out of the fields. And if you've ever tried to garden or do anything in the Ozarks, deer. There's just a certain amount of deer you'll have to put up with, and there's always the chance of shooting them too when they come around. So that may not be half bad. Yeah. But yeah, this photo. I think I got this photo from one of the national park websites or something. It's just for looks. There, it's obviously not. It just peters out there, and it's obviously not doing anything now. But and then if you were really industrious, some farmers would have little kind of stairways over the rail fence, so that you didn't have to crawl up there all haphazardly and fall up. You just kind of walk over. You still see some people today who build fences and put little walkways over them, or have little ingenious little, things where a human can kind of maneuver through and a cow can't do it, that sort of thing. But we talked about the log rollings already. All of these were kind of tied together. They were all activities of the frontier, and activities that continued in neighborhoods for years afterward. Because one of the things that happens, even after your family has been in the rural Ozarks for a generation or 2 generations or 3 generations, you've been farming all this time, and eventually you kind of wear out the land. And in the 19th century, you didn't have commercial fertilizer or anything like that. You had, manure from animals, but that only goes so far. And eventually, farm families would decide to clear new land. And when that happened, you're back to your log rollings and that sort of stuff. So that was an activity that continued to go on. And families continue to build corn cribs and barns and houses and all that kind of stuff. So you still have these house raisings and barn raisings that continue into the 20th century. Yeah. All right, we're just going to kind of skip around a little bit and talk about different sorts of folk arts and crafts and things. And here we're talking about what you might call folk artisans, people who had specific skills that were useful in a community. Some of them were the kinds of skills that you could make a living out of. As the Ozarks started to fill up with settlers, eventually a community was large enough and had enough farmers in it that a person could make a living as a blacksmith. Usually what happened in the first generation of settlement is that there would be a farmer or two who ran their farm but also did blacksmithing on the side. And most farmers, to a certain degree, did basic blacksmithing work. They might not have the whole outfit to be a full-fledged blacksmith. But after a generation or so, most rural communities would have a full-time blacksmith somewhere. And there were all kinds of metal work that needed to be done in the rural Ozarks to keep farmers going, to keep them in business, repairing things, building things. And so there was no shortage of work for a blacksmith. And that was one of the few skills, non-farming skills in the rural Ozarks that made large numbers of people living in the 1800s and first half of the 1900s. If you go look at old census records and you go down the list of people who lived in such and such township and such county, they're listed by occupation, or that their occupation is listed with their name. And lots of blacksmiths in the Ozarks. You rarely ever see somebody in the rural Ozarks in the 19th century or 20th century listed as a potter or even a gunsmith or something like that. Could happen, but those kinds of trades and skills were generally practiced by farmers or somebody else who, that wasn't their main line of business. They tended to do that on the side. But you did have people in the Ozarks who, on occasion, who made pottery. Much of the pottery that was used in the Ozarks was imported, so there weren't potters in every community like there would be a blacksmith in every community. Most communities had someone who was at least a decent gunsmith. Might not be a professional gunsmith, but someone who knew their way around a gun and could repair and whatever the farmers needed to have repaired. And so gunsmithing was a common trade. Now, basket making was something that was not uncommon either in the 19th century Ozarks, and it was one of those trades that became kind of glorified in the 20th century Ozarks. And so by the mid-20th century, you probably had more people making a living as basket makers than there ever were in the 19th century Ozarks. For the most part, in the 19th century Ozarks, basket makers were farmers who just happened to be good at making baskets of different kinds. And as we'll see, that kind of changes in the 20th century as baskets, especially white oak baskets, that's the most common kind of, when you think of Ozark basket makers, most of them use strips of white oak to make these very sturdy baskets that they make, like the ones that are pictured here. These became very, very highly prized items in the 20th century, mainly by urban people who wanted to buy authentic, Ozark-made or Appalachian-made white oak baskets and would pay pretty good money. And certainly by the standards of the Ozarks, it was good money that they could get for these. I believe that these two fellows pictured here are from an Arkansas family named Gibson, who were noted white oak basket makers for years and years in northwest Arkansas. One of the interesting white oak basket stories of the Ozarks is a place called Ville. There was a little community called Clementine up in Phelps County, Missouri, and Phelps County is where Rolla, Missouri is, and Clementine was west of Rolla. It's just off of I-44 now. I don't know that there's a sign or anything up there for Baskettville or Clementine or anything like that. But there was this little place at Clementine, and when they built Route 66, which is roughly the old what I-44 is today, down through there, it went through this little place called Clementine, and there was a family of basket makers who moved up to Clementine from Cabul, Missouri, which is in the southern part of Texas County over in south central Missouri, because they knew there would be a lot of traffic on that road and they were wanting to sell these baskets that they were making. Well, this little place, Clementine, becomes so associated with Ozark white oak baskets that eventually people start calling it Basketville. And that's what it's known as for years when Route 66 is still going through Basketville. And not only this one family, but I think... I can't think of the family's name. But eventually there are about 3 or 4 different families in this one little community who make white oak baskets and mainly sell them to tourists and travelers coming through town. And they have shops advertising their baskets and all that kind of stuff. And of course, when the highway department makes changes to Route 66 and they kind of alter and nowadays with I-44, it ruins the business there in Basketville, and that kind of brings that little segment of Ozarks history to an end. But it was a good example of an old skill that these people's ancestors had brought with them from Virginia or Kentucky or North Carolina, wherever they came from, to the Ozarks, and they were able to utilize that skill and find a market for it in the 20th century when they realized city people would pay money for this stuff we've been making, and were able to make a living for a while. One of the families there in Basketville even set up kind of a little, almost like a factory, like a basket-making factory, and didn't necessarily make them all by hand. They even developed a way to something close to mass-produce baskets for the market, and then they would sell them to retailers up and down Route 66. So you can still buy white oak baskets at different places in the Ozarks today. And in the little community that I grew up in, one of the last, I guess you would say the last industry we had was a white oak basket maker. And I believe he still makes them every once in a while. He just doesn't have his store's not open anymore. But you had some people in the community who were specialists at making brooms. And these could be made with a special kind of corn grown for the purpose called broom corn, or they could be made with corn shucks, or various other things that whatever ingenious ideas you could have of coming up with making a broom. There were people who made mops, basically dust mops, with corn shucks and that kind of stuffed through a hole in a block of wood and hooked onto a handle. And there are lots of different ways that you could make these sort of things. But broom making is another thing that has become kind of an artsy craft sort of thing. And if you go to the Ozark Folk Center down in Mountain View, Arkansas, they have a broom maker. They have a white oak basket maker there. They have a potter. They have all of these crafts. But the broom makers are especially popular, and most of the brooms today are not actually used for sweeping. They're used for decorative purposes. You hang them on the wall, and they'll have like different colored strands in the broom, and they're just sort of pretty brooms. And who wouldn't rather have a pretty broom than just a regular old kitchen broom? But coopers. There were lots of coopers in the rural Ozarks and the rural everywhere in America, and there were different kinds of coopers. A cooper, the basic thing that a cooper does is make barrels or containers, not necessarily barrels, but containers for holding stuff. Back in the day, when every container wasn't made out of plastic or glass, when you had to use wood to make most of the containers you had for just about anything. And you had at least 3 different kinds of coopering that was done, 3 different kinds of coopers. You had your dry, white, and wet coopers. What do you think a dry cooper made? What kinds of containers?
Nails and things like that in there.
Yeah, nails. Right. Anything that back in the 19th century, early 20th century would have been labeled as dry goods, a store that sold dry goods. Nails especially popular. Even foods that aren't wet, fruit or vegetables could be held in these barrels or cans. So there was lots of different things that you made, barrels to hold dry goods. They didn't have to be sealed up, to hold water in. White coopers. Anybody know what a white cooper would have made? Well, it's a good guess. Flour, enriched white flour. A white cooper. Generally, white coopering referred to making containers to hold liquids that were not shipped anywhere. For instance, like a butter churn would be a product of white coopering, or like a milk pail, a wooden milk pail, something that you just use around the farm or around the house, and you're not actually sealing it up and putting it on a wagon and shipping it to the next state, or putting it on a railroad car and shipping it out like that. That's what white coopering refers to. And then the last one, wet coopering, refers to making kegs for beer, for your whiskey barrels, casks for wine, any sort of liquid like that that's actually stored and shipped, or can be stored and shipped. That's what kind of coopering that's for. And usually in the Ozarks, we'll talk later in the semester about the coming of industry and the timber industry and the lumber industry to the Ozarks. There were lots of cooperages that were built around the Ozarks. These were factories where you made barrels. And most of the cooperages that were built in the Ozarks were wet cooperages. They were built for making whiskey barrels or wine casks, that sort of thing. They were for that purpose and used all over the world, shipped across the country and around the world. So different kinds of different.
Still make them in Lebanon?
Yeah, there's still Yeah.
All this walnuts or whatever it is wood out there stacked.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure how many cooperages there are in the region today. That certainly not near as many as there once were, but you know, you still have barrels.
That's a big operation.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, we don't. I'm guessing that you know that there's not as much of a demand for wooden barrels as there once was. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. In the Ozarks, there's quite a bit. Yeah. 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 They do. Yeah. Did you?
There's a lot of aesthetics. I have a friend who works with that up there. And
Right.
A lot of their contracts on for
Yeah.
like decoration and stuff like that.
Yeah, that would make sense too. Yeah. 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 Get your whiskey barrel, you know, for the living room, and your white oak basket for the kitchen, you know, that sort of thing. Just have a good Ozark lumber theme going on there. All right. But these are real. If you've ever seen these handmade white oak baskets, some of them are just elaborate. I mean, you can tell that thing is huge. And they, the basket maker that I know has different names for the styles of baskets that he makes, and you know, apple baskets and this and that. You can use them for whatever you want, but they're different sizes, and some of them have handles that, you know, these kind of Easter basket sort of handles. Some of them have the handles on the side and stuff like that. But you know, some of them are really big, like apple kind of baskets there. The kind that cobras rise out of, you know. We've seen that on movies. I'm not sure that happened a lot in the Ozarks. Maybe a puff adder, or, you know, different kinds of snakes coming out of there. Copperhead. All right. Some outdoor skills of the pioneers. And we could spend a whole class talking about just outdoor skills. We're just going to hit some of the highlights here and move on. But these are things that early settlers would have done. At least some members of a neighborhood in the rural Ozarks would have known how to accomplish these various feats and to do these things. And some people still in the Ozarks. Bee hunting. What is bee hunting? How do you bee hunt?
Queen or something to build
Well,
hive?
if you're wanting to start your own bee gum at your house, you could be out looking. It's basically just what it sounds like, hunting for beehives. And in the 19th century, you would have been hunting for these in trees, usually in hollowed out trees somewhere. But you don't just go traipsing through the forest looking for signs of bees or swarms of bees. You can do that, but often the bee hunters would find, for instance, where the bees were coming to, congregating, where they were maybe coming to flowering plants or coming to get water, and would course them, what they call coursing them, or tracing them back to where they came. You know, they say that bees will fly in straight lines. You know, they don't really have to follow the roads like we do. They may be the only thing in the Ozarks, you know, going anywhere in a straight line. The rest of us don't get to. But I remember hearing my grandpa talk about throwing flour on bees so that you could see them flying through the air better. Like you sit and wait for them to, you find out wherever they're coming, and whatever they're doing, their job, they're going to turn around and go back to their hive, and you flour them or you throw something on them that you'll be able to see, and you can follow them. And a good bee hunter could usually just sort of figure out the direction that they were going. And if you waited there, a few hours, that same bee that you had dusted with something would come back, and you can kind of figure out how long did it take him to get back here. And if you're good at your craft, you'll know about how far he's had to fly, and you can see which direction he's going. And if you can sort of walk in the same direction, you're going to get close. And so bee hunters had various methods of finding these bee trees. It was why would you care? What's so big about finding a bee tree? The honey in the 19th century. This is a day when these settlers didn't go to the store and buy sugar. Honey was a sweetening. It may be the only sweet thing that you have, and it was highly prized by settlers across the country, not just in the Ozarks. And so it made people want to get out and find these bee trees. And there were even methods for cutting trees down. This is the day before chainsaws, so you didn't find a bee tree and just go up and saw it down. But bee hunters would try to fell the tree onto another tree, not just have it smack flat on the ground, because what would happen then? If you just cut a bee tree down, it just... Well, you can make them really mad, and if you're obviously around because you cut the tree down. But it's liable to break up, especially if it's a hollow tree. It means part of it's dead. It's liable to just splinter and maybe break up the hive and mess up the honey and all that kind of stuff. So you want to kind of fall it maybe on another tree and find some way to sort of ease it down. It's probably a better method than the old bear method. Just crawl up in the tree with them, and reach in there and see what you can grab. But so bee hunting was there, and every community pretty much would have someone who was known as the expert bee hunter in the community. Somebody would have that reputation. And there are still people who are in the bee business today. Not a lot of people go out and bee hunt anymore, but there are some people in the Ozarks who still look for those bees in the wild. And they've all been introduced to North America. So you got bee hunting, you got sugar camps. What's a sugar camp? Sounds like someplace better than band camp, doesn't it?
Maple trees.
There you go. Yeah, it's a maple sugar. Another way to get sweetening in the 19th century was by tapping maple trees. And some people were serious enough about it where they would set up what they called sugar camps. And you might spend 2 or 3 weeks at a location with a lot of maple trees, usually in late winter, early spring. And you tap the trees and getting the sap out, and that became known as sugar camps. And I've got somewhere, I think it may be the same fellow that we had. Here you go. Yeah, it's the same guy, James Campbell, again up in central Missouri. He's actually in the Missouri River Valley, but people were doing this in the Ozarks as well. And he talks about on February 9th, and this was in 1821, February 9th, 1821, he spent the day making sugar troughs. So, I'm sure he made them out of logs, and this is containers, to hold this in. And then it says, on March 1st, go to sugar camp, trees run well. That's what he writes. Go to sugar camp, trees run well. So he's got them going. He had tried about a month earlier, and he mentioned that the trees weren't running well. So he waited till a little bit later in the winter, kind of the early spring. And then on March 2nd, he says make 24 pounds at camp. March 3rd, make 23 pounds. March 4th, make 22 pounds. Sort of a pattern there. You know, I guess I don't know if he stays till he's down to 1 pound a day, but he does, for several days, he's at this sugar camp, tapping these maple trees. And so that becomes a popular activity on the frontier for some people in the rural Ozarks. Now here's the next one refers to the picture here. Has anybody ever made a turkey trap, or what was sometimes called a turkey pen? Well, you're looking at one there. That was a 19th century turkey trap or turkey pen that actually caught turkeys. Does anybody know how it worked? It's hard to tell there how the thing works. You can see this one turkey peeking out, like, uh-oh, you guys might as well just leave. I'm in for it. It's close to Thanksgiving. But have you ever used a minute trap? Some of you used a minute trap, you know.
Place where the turkey can get into easily. You got some kind of bait in there, and you just can't figure out how to get out.
That's right. It works on the same concept as a minute trap. You bait them in, and you've got an obvious way in, and then you rely on basically the stupidity of the animal to not be able to find their way out. So what they would do, making these turkey pens or turkey traps, they would build this first of all, they would dig a trench, 10 or 15 feet long trench, a couple feet deep in the ground, and they would have it sort of angling down and then angling back up. And over one end of the trench, they would build this little pen, using logs. If you're dealing with a turkey, it's not like they're going to throw them off. You just kind of stack them on top of each other, put a heavy log or two on top to sort of weight down the whole contraption, keep it from falling apart. And the idea is you scatter corn or something through this trench, and the idea is that the turkey is too busy, pecking at the corn, and just follows it up underneath this pen, and the opening is going to be in the middle of the pen somewhere. And first thing the turkey knows, she or he is in the middle of this wooden cage here. And how are they going to try to get out? They're going to go to the edge and look out where they can actually see daylight through these logs, and all they'll do is just go around and around the edge, around the cage, and will never think to go back to the middle and retrace their steps and go out the trench. Similar to a minnow trap, the minnows go in, and then they just kind of hang around the edges, and never, there's a little circle about like that they could swim back out, but they rarely ever do it. They're too busy trying to get out the sides. And so that's obviously what this turkey's doing. But this was used by many people on the Ozarks frontier, and in some cases probably, into the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was a way, especially if lead was in short supply, or if you were like me and you were a terrible shot. This is probably a much surer way of landing a turkey, is just build one of these little pens. You could also use these for catching wolves. Obviously, you would need a sturdier pen for that, and you would want a gun to finish it off once you came up and it's in there. And I've even read about people building bear pens. And you would want a really sturdy pen in that case. But apparently bears and wolves both as well would just kind of circle around, just walk circles around the edges of the pen there, the cage, and wouldn't go back out the middle. You'd have to build a bigger trench for them to get into. But the same concept again applied. And bear traps, bear hunting was such a common thing on the Ozarks frontier that I wouldn't doubt if people did have a lot of these bear pens, because you read about any early Ozark settler And half of what they talk about is bear hunting. There were so many bears, and it was such a common activity. They're big animals. You know, even a bad shot can probably hit a bear, you know, from not too far away. And it was kind of for a lot of bear hunters, it was a sort of manly activity, you know, bear hunting, you know, that kind of thing. Not exactly squirrel hunting, you know, you're hunting something that could kill you or may kill your dogs, that sort of thing. And bear meat was highly prized. People on the Ozarks frontier loved bear meat. You can read all kinds of accounts of them eating bear meat. Bear oil or bear grease, rendered from bear fat, was sold, and it was valuable. Today, there's a little bitty, tiny community just outside of the Ozarks on the lower White River in Arkansas called Oil Trough. And the town gets its name from troughs that were made, these homemade troughs, kind of like the sugar trough the guy made, but they were for bear oil. Bear hunters would make these. And the troughs, it was said that the troughs, many of them during floods or during high waters, that would get swept down the White River and kind of wash out in the flatlands of the delta where this town Oil Trough is today. And so bears were very important. Tanneries, obviously, tanneries are setups for tanning hides. And this was something that, again, most communities in the rural Ozarks, certainly by the time of the Civil War, would have at least one tannery. And sometimes, like blacksmiths, tanners were full-time tanners, or that was their main occupation. They may farm on the side. And they could tan pretty much any kind of hide. Deer hides, cow hides obviously were commonly tanned. But I even came across this was a really neat, this was an old doctor's ledger from the late 1800s. It was from Northwest Arkansas. And this doctor had in the back of his ledger, the ledger actually kept up with his patients and what he had prescribed for them and what was wrong with them and how much money he had charged them. What do you think in 1865 a house call and a little bit of medicine cost? Even cheaper than that. Now this was Arkansas, so I'm not sure. And this guy may or may not have been a real doctor. You know, he could have just said, "I'm a doctor," and who knows? You know, medical schools weren't what they are now back in those days. $250. He charged $250 for a house call and a little bit of medicine. So, you know, I'd take that today. Wouldn't you take? But anyway, in the back of this ledger, he had this extended. He was also a tanner. You got to wonder about a doctor who's tanning hides on the side. I think I've seen that movie before. You know, real late at night. But he had these detailed instructions. I've got copies of it. These detailed instructions for how to tan all kinds of hides. I mean, sheep hides, squirrel hides, deer hides, cow hides, and to get them different colors, different styles, all that kind of stuff. But it was very detailed with all the chemicals that you needed. Of course, the early tanners would get the chemicals from a lot of times from bark. Tannin actually comes from an old German word that meant oak or fir, or it meant some kind of like tree sort of thing. Tannenbaum, the O Tannenbaum, the German we call it Christmas tree. Yeah, that's same root sort of thing there. But these tanneries became very important and very common on the Ozarks frontier. And a lot of people just had the knowledge to do basic tanning at home. Although tanning it's an extended process that lasts over several days. If you're actually going to tan something the way you're supposed to tan it, in his description, some of this stuff would take more than a week to do what you needed to do to go through all the stages of soaking this and then adding the chemicals, and it soaks 18 hours in this and that sort of thing. But tanning was very important and was an important skill and industry in the Ozarks. And then the last thing, the saltpeter industry, or using saltpeter. What was saltpeter most commonly used for in those days? Right, for producing gunpowder. Obviously a very important thing for people in a place like the rural Ozarks in the 19th century. You need gunpowder. And so saltpeter was something that was found widely in caves in the Ozarks. And you had a lot of, in the earliest days of settlement in the Ozarks, you had a lot of saltpeter mining operations and gunpowder production operations. And again, it was something that could be mined and used and produced in the region. And now there weren't too many people making a living as producing gunpowder or mining saltpeter or anything like that, but it was, again, something that was widely available around the region, and a lot of people got into this business or into this little sideline.